For centuries, the Christmas story has been retold with a familiar image. Mary and Joseph are turned away, forced to seek shelter in a cold animal stable to give birth. Yet this deeply tragic scene is built largely upon an inaccurate translation of Scripture. The Greek word kataluma in the Gospel of Luke does not mean inn, as it is commonly assumed, but rather a guest room within a family home. It refers to a space of kinship, familiarity, and hospitality, entirely different from a commercial lodging place. This becomes clear when Luke, in other passages, uses the word pandion to refer explicitly to a commercial inn. He draws a clear distinction between domestic space and places of business. Therefore, when Luke states that there was no room in the kataluma, he is not describing a cold refusal, but simply noting that the guest room was already full. The historical context is a census that caused Bethlehem to overflow with people returning to their ancestral town. Homes that were already modest in size had to accommodate additional relatives from afar, making overcrowding unavoidable. When this detail is properly understood, the entire Christmas narrative shifts in tone. There is no heartless innkeeper, no door slammed shut in Mary's face. Jesus was not pushed to the margins of society from the moment of his birth. On the contrary, he was born within the home of relatives, surrounded by family, in circumstances that were cramped but not lonely. This is not a story of rejection, but a story of a God who willingly enters the very human limits of our existence. Christmas, therefore, does not begin with the coldness of refusal, but with the quiet humility of the Word made flesh. God does not wait for a perfect space before coming to humanity. He chooses to dwell even when the house is already full, when human life is still cluttered and unprepared. And it is precisely within that crowdedness that new life is born, marking the beginning of a story of salvation that does not start with tragedy, but with presence. Once we understand that kataluma refers to a guest room within a family home, a natural question arises: if there was no space in the guest room, then where was Jesus born? The answer lies in the very structure of first-century Jewish homes, a small historical detail with the power to transform how we imagine the night of Christmas. Homes in that period were not arranged with a strict separation between human living space and animal shelters as we tend to assume today. The most common design was a two-level house. The upper level was used for sleeping and receiving guests, while the lower level functioned as the main living area. At night, especially during colder seasons, families would bring small animals such as sheep or goats into this lower space for warmth and protection. For this reason, the presence of animals did not imply filth or isolation, but was a completely ordinary part of family life. In that context, a manger was not a crude feeding trough placed outdoors, but often a stone feeding basin carved into the floor or wall within the living area itself. When Luke mentions the manger, he is describing a detail that would have been entirely familiar to his original audience. This indicates that Mary did not give birth in a separate stable, but in the lower level of a house, a place with lamplight, warmth, and the presence of others. This image carries profound theological meaning. God did not choose to enter humanity from a distant, marginal, or excluded place, but from the very center of ordinary life. He was not born in a palace, yet neither was he pushed outside society. He came into the rhythm of family life, where people eat, talk, rest, and share the most ordinary moments of existence. Christmas, therefore, is not a story of loneliness, but a story of an intimacy almost beyond belief. When we shift our perspective in this way, Christmas night is no longer a cold scene of straw and night wind, but a warm, crowded space, overflowing with life. And it is precisely in that seemingly ordinary setting that the most extraordinary thing occurred. God chose to dwell among humanity, right inside their home. When we hear the word manger, most of us immediately think of poverty, deprivation, or even abandonment. Yet within the biblical and Jewish cultural context, the manger carries a very different meaning. For first-century Jews, a manger was not merely a feeding place for animals, but a familiar sign closely associated with shepherding and sacrifice. It is precisely here that the Christmas story opens into a far deeper prophetic dimension. Near Bethlehem stood a place known as Migdal Eder, the Tower of the Flock. This was not an ordinary grazing area, but a region overseen by priests, where sheep destined for sacrifice in the Temple of Jerusalem were carefully raised, examined, and protected. Lambs born there had to be without blemish or injury, and were often wrapped in cloths and placed in a manger to safeguard them from harm immediately after birth. This was a well-known practice among shepherds who served the temple. When Luke records that the child was wrapped in swaddling cloths and laid in a manger, he is not describing a random or sentimental detail. He is offering a deliberate sign, especially for the shepherds, men who would have immediately understood its meaning. A newborn laid in a manger, in the very region associated with temple flocks, is not an image of destitution, but the language of prophecy. It is God's way of declaring, the true Lamb has arrived. At this point, Christmas is no longer merely a touching story, but a theologically profound event. From the very first moment, the life of Jesus is placed in direct relationship with sacrifice. He is born not simply as a human child, but as the Lamb set apart, laid where sacrificial lambs once rested. No lengthy explanation is needed, no grand proclamation required, the sign itself is sufficient for those with eyes to see. What invites deeper reflection is this: God did not choose unfamiliar symbols to reveal himself. He used the most familiar images of Scripture and Jewish life to disclose the identity of his Son. The manger, therefore, does not speak of humiliation, but of a plan of salvation prepared long ago, quiet, precise, and never accidental. For a long time, the details surrounding Christmas night were often treated as symbolic imagery rather than historical data. Yet archaeological discoveries over recent decades have gradually revealed that Luke's account is not the product of imagination, but a remarkably accurate reflection of first-century life in Israel. What was once dismissed as religious tradition is now being confirmed by stone, floor plans, and the traces of everyday living left behind. Excavations in the Bethlehem region and in other contemporary Jewish settlements consistently reveal the same feature: stone mangers carved directly into the family living space. They were not located outdoors, nor were they part of separate wooden stables as commonly portrayed in Western art. These stone feeding troughs were typically set against the walls or floors of the lower level, where families carried out daily activities and brought small animals inside at night. This aligns precisely with Luke's brief yet accurate description. Archaeology also confirms that two-level house structures were widespread in Jewish society at the time. The upper room, identified as the kataluma, was reserved for guests or special occasions. When this space was already occupied, the lower level became a flexible area that could be cleared to meet urgent needs, including childbirth. Therefore, Mary giving birth on the lower level was neither unusual nor demeaning, but a practical and culturally appropriate choice. Significantly, archaeology has uncovered no evidence of detached wooden stables like those commonly seen in modern Christmas displays. That image reflects medieval European life far more than ancient Jewish reality. In other words, we have unintentionally imposed our own cultural assumptions onto a very different world, and in doing so, misunderstood the story. When archaeological findings are placed alongside the biblical text, they do not contradict one another, but mutually illuminate and reinforce the narrative. Christmas night emerges not as a vague legend, but as an event rooted in a specific place, time, and culture. And this is precisely what makes the mystery of the Incarnation more intimate. God did not step onto a mythical stage, but entered a real house, on real stone floors, among real people. As layers of misunderstanding are gradually peeled away, what changes is not only the setting of Christmas night, but our entire perception of God. The familiar image of an infant turned away, born in isolation and absolute poverty, has been deeply embedded in the imagination of generations. But if this image does not faithfully reflect the biblical text or its historical context, then an important question arises: have we unintentionally imposed a sadness on Christmas that does not truly belong to it? When Christmas is re-examined through the lenses of language, culture, and archaeology, it ceases to be a story of coldness and rejection, and becomes instead a story of a closeness that is almost uncomfortable. God does not stand outside knocking at the door of human life, he enters from within, from a crowded house, amid noise, lack of privacy, and the very real inconveniences of ordinary living. This is not a romanticizing of poverty, but a powerful declaration: God chooses to remain with humanity exactly as it is. This reversal carries profound theological consequences. If Jesus was not born into rejection, then the core message of Christmas is not, humanity had no room for God, but rather, God did not wait for humanity to make room for him. He comes when life is still messy, when space is already tight, when nothing is yet perfect. And it is precisely this reality that makes the mystery of the Incarnation so tangible, so deeply connected to the lived experiences of every person. Perhaps this is why Christmas continues to move hearts so powerfully. Not because it tells a tragic story, but because it proclaims a deeply consoling truth: God is not afraid to enter the cramped spaces of human life. He does not avoid disorder, demand ideal conditions, or wait in some elevated place. He comes and he stays, right in the midst of everyday rhythms, where people are most likely to feel exhausted, overwhelmed, and unprepared. And when Christmas is understood in this way, faith no longer feels like a burden of having to prepare enough, but becomes a gentle invitation to allow God to be present, even when our lives are not yet in order. When the entire Christmas story is revisited in the light of language, culture, and history, what remains is not a shocking revelation, but a quiet and profound truth: God chose to stay. Not in some distant place, not on the margins of society, and not within a perfectly arranged setting, but at the very center of human life. He was born in a house, among family, within the rhythms of ordinary living, where there is crowding and inconvenience, but also presence and warmth. Christmas, therefore, is not the story of humanity failing to make room for God, but the story of God's willingness to enter spaces that are not yet ready. He does not wait for the house to be perfectly ordered, nor for life to become stable or ideal. He comes when the guest room is already full, when the lower space must be hastily rearranged, when everything unfolds in simplicity and everyday realism. And it is precisely there that new life is born. The image of the infant lying in a manger, placed within the home, is no longer a symbol of abandonment, but a sign of a deeply loving choice. God chooses to be so near to humanity that no distance remains. He does not remain above, looking down, nor does he keep himself in a place of safety. He enters into human limitation, weariness, and imperfection, not to judge, but to remain and to accompany. Perhaps this is also the deepest invitation of Christmas for each person today. When life becomes overwhelming, when our hearts are crowded with concerns, when nothing seems fully in place, we often believe we are not ready for God. Yet the Christmas story whispers something else: God does not wait for us to be ready, he waits only for our permission to stay. And perhaps Christmas truly begins not when we build a nativity scene or light festive decorations, but when we realize that even within the crowded, unfinished house of our own lives, God is already present.